Welcome to Sleepy Love Tales, soothing romantic stories to help you relax and fall asleep. Let us know where you're listening from in the comments. If soft, heartfelt tales help you unwind, be sure to subscribe so you never miss a moment of calm. Now, let's begin tonight's story. The Katahdin Promise. The rain had been a constant companion for 3 days, a merciless drumming beat against the hood of Elara's jacket. It wasn't the gentle, life-giving rain of poems, but a cold, aggressive torrent that turned the world to a monochrome blur of grey sky and brown mud. 3 weeks. It had been 3 weeks since she'd stood on Springer Mountain, full of a desperate manufactured hope that to the weight of miles of wilderness could somehow rearrange the scattered pieces of her life. Almost a year ago, she'd been in a cap and gown, the fabric itching against her neck, a fixed smile plastered on her face as relatives asked the same suffocating question. So, what's the plan? The plan. As if life were a blueprint you were handed with your diploma. Her friends had plans, consulting jobs, grad school, internships that blossomed into careers. Elara had a degree in literature and a hollow feeling in her chest. So she'd concocted an escape she'd framed as a plan. A through hike of the Appalachian Trail. It sounded brave, adventurous. It sounded like anything other than what it was, running away. She thought the trail would provide answers, that the rhythm of walking would pound clarity into her bones. Instead, it had only amplified the silence inside her, a vast emptiness that echoed the endless green tunnel of trees. A slick root, disguised by a layer of decaying leaves, caught her boot, sending her crashing down. Her knee slammed into a rock, and the impact sent a sickening jolt up her leg. She didn't even cry out. She just lay there, face half pressed into the mud, as the cold seeped through her waterproof layers, which had long ago surrendered. Every muscle already screaming from the relentless climbs and descents of the southern Appalachians now throbbed with a fresh wave of agony. "What am I even doing out here?" she whispered, the words swallowed by the storm. Her own voice sounded foreign, thin. "Everyone else has a 5-year plan. I don't even have a 5-minute plan, just mud. And this cold that goes all the way to your bones. Maybe I'm just not built for this. Maybe I'm not built for anything." Tears finally came, hot and pointless against her rain-chilled skin. She pushed herself up, her movements slow and heavy, and leaned her back against the rough bark of an oak. The sucking sound of her boots pulling free from the mud was a sound of defeat. This wasn't a journey of self-discovery. It was a slow, painful surrender to the elements. With trembling, numb fingers, she fumbled inside her pack for her satellite messenger. She'd programmed a message before she left. "I'm done, come get me." It was for emergencies, but this felt like one, an emergency of the soul. Her thumb hovered over the send button. The thought of the subsequent phone calls, the mixture of relief and disappointment in her parents' voices, the quiet "I told you so" from her friends. It was a humiliation she could barely stomach. But the alternative, another day, another week of the misery, felt impossible. Her eyes fell to the trail guide tucked into the mesh pocket of her pack. The pages were swollen and warped from the damp, the ink slightly blurred. She pulled it out, her movements clumsy. Her finger traced the red line of the trail, past her current miserable position. "Standing Bear Farm," the text read. A legendary hostel, a sanctuary. She'd read about it in the shelter logs, notes from hikers ahead of her praising its warmth, its ramshackle charm, its almost mythical status as a place to heal. It was just a few more miles. A deal. She made a deal with the part of herself that hadn't completely given up. She would get to Standing Bear Farm. She would get warm. She would have one last night in the strange transient community of the trail, and then, in the morning, she would quit. With that fragile pack, she pushed herself away from the tree, ignoring the protest of her bruised knee, and took one more squelching step north. Elara stumbled into Standing Bear Farm like a refugee seeking asylum. It wasn't a picturesque lodge, it was a chaotic, beautiful jumble of weathered wood buildings, prayer flags, and smiling bearded faces that all seemed to understand the exact kind of hell she'd just walked through. The air smelled of wood smoke, damp wool, and something wonderfully, unbelievably like hope. Someone pointed her toward an open bunk in the main hostel, and she dropped her heavy soaked pack with a thud that felt final. The shower was a miracle. For 20 minutes she stood under the stream of hot water, letting it wash away not just the grime of the trail, but the layers of despair that had clung to her like a second skin. She watched the mud swirl down the drain, a symbolic release of the Tennessee drownout. When she finally emerged, skin pink and pruned, she felt lighter than she had in weeks. Dressed in her last set of clean, dry clothes, a pair of soft leggings and a worn-out t-shirt, she felt almost human again. Dusk was settling, and a communal fire was crackling in a large stone pit outside. Drawn by a sound that cut through the murmur of hiker chatter, she walked toward it. It was the sound of an acoustic guitar, its notes rich and clear in the cool evening air, accompanied by a voice that was pure soulful folk. It was a sound of melancholic beauty, a ballad of lost paths and hard-won resilience. She saw him then, and the world tilted slightly on its axis. He was leaning against a porch post, bathed in the fire's golden glow, eyes closed as he sang. He had a strong jawline softened by a few days of stubble, and dark wavy hair that fell across his forehead. But it was the raw, unguarded emotion in his voice that captured her, holding her motionless on a nearby bench. The song's lyrics spoke of a fastball that had lost its furrow, of walking a new baseline, of trading a manicured field for a wild, untamed path. It felt like he was singing her own story, a story she didn't even have the words for yet. He strummed the final resonant chord, letting it hang in the air for a perfect, still moment. Then his eyes opened, and they found hers across the dancing flames. It wasn't a glance, it was a collision. The chatter of the other hikers, the crackle of the fire, the chirping of the crickets, it all faded into a muted hum. In his dark, intense eyes, she saw a flicker of the same weariness, the same searching that she felt in her own soul. For a second, she wasn't a quitter covered in mud. She was just seen. A slow, gentle smile touched his lips, reaching his eyes. He shifted, his posture relaxing as the spell broke. The sounds of the evening rushed back in. "Hey, pretty little lady," he said, his voice a low, warm rumble that was even better up close. "What's your name?" The question was so simple, yet her mind went completely blank. It was the kind of eye contact that makes you forget your own name. She felt a blush creep up her neck, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. "Elara," she finally managed, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded slowly, his gaze still holding hers. "Liam? Glad you made it, Elara." He said her name as if it were a song he was just learning to play, and in that moment, huddled in the warmth of a stranger's music and an even stranger's smile, Elara's carefully constructed plan to quit began to unravel. The next morning, Elara found Liam nursing a cup of coffee by the cold fire pit. The air was crisp, washed clean by the storm. Her plan had been to ask for a shuttle into the nearest town. Instead, she heard herself asking, "Which way are you headed?" "North," he said, a simple answer that felt like an invitation. Always north. They decided to hike together for a day. That day bled into a week, and soon the idea of hiking without him felt as foreign as the life she'd left behind. They fell into a rhythm, his long athletic strides pushing her, her thoughtful pace forcing him to notice the small wonders of the trail he'd been rushing past. Virginia unfolded before them, a seemingly endless stretch of green that had earned the name the Virginia Blues from countless hikers before them. But for Elara, it was anything but blue. It was the landscape of their beginning. The miles were filled with stories. He taught her how to read the clouds for signs of rain, how to listen for the rustle of a black bear in the undergrowth. She taught him the names of the wildflowers that dotted the trailside: trillium, lady slipper, bloodroot. The trail became their confessional. Under the vast, starry skies at trail shelters, their voices low murmurs in the quiet of the woods, they unwrapped their pasts for each other. Liam spoke of the crushing pressure of being a top baseball prospect, the boy with the $1 million arm. He described the sharp, tearing pain in his shoulder that ended it all, and the deeper pain of losing the only identity he'd ever known. "The scout said I had $1 million arm," he said one night, his voice laced with old grief. "Turns out it only takes one bad throw to make it worthless." "Maybe its worth isn't about throwing a ball," Elara replied softly, her fingers tracing the constellations above them. "Maybe it's about being strong enough to hold a guitar, or my hand when I'm about to slip." She in turn spoke of her own quiet fears, the suffocating weight of an unwritten future, the feeling of being an imposter among her high-achieving peers. With Liam the words came easily, the shame lifting with each confession. He didn't offer solutions, he just listened, his presence a steady, comforting anchor. One sweltering afternoon they followed the sound of rushing water off trail and discovered a hidden swimming hole, a perfect emerald pool fed by a small waterfall. A mischievous look passed between them, a silent dare. Moments later their clothes were in piles on the sun-warmed rocks, and they were plunging into the shockingly cold water. Their gasps turned to laughter, a pure, unburdened sound that echoed off the rock walls. Under the water, his hand brushed against hers as they treaded water, and the jolt was more electrifying than the cold. In that sun-dappled sanctuary, they were just two people, free from their pasts, alive in the moment. Other hikers began to notice the easy orbit they had around each other. They were no longer just Elara and Liam. They were a unit. It was a grizzled, older hiker named Pops who gave them their trail names. Liam for his legendary fastball and the easy way he could slide a story into any conversation became Mula. Elara for her quiet, determined search for direction became Compass's Rose. The names stuck, a new identity forged together on the trail. They were Slider and Compass Rose, a partnership growing closer with every mile, the slow burn of their connection warming them more than any campfire. The White Mountains of New Hampshire were a different beast entirely. The trail, which had been a rugged but manageable path, transformed into a series of near-vertical rock scrambles that demanded hands as well as feet. The climbs were longer, the descents more treacherous, and the weather, they were warned, was a fickle god. They had been hiking above the tree line for an hour, the world a breathtaking panorama of granite and sky when the change came. It started subtly. The brilliant blue sky hazed over, and a cool breeze whispered across the exposed ridge. Within minutes, the whisper became a howl, and dark, bruised-looking clouds boiled over the western peaks, racing toward them with unnatural speed. The temperature plummeted. Elara zipped her fleece to her chin, her earlier awe turning to a knot of anxiety in her stomach. "We need to get lower," Liam's voice was calm but urgent, cutting through the rising wind. "Now!" But there was nowhere to go. They were on a narrow spine of rock, a stone walkway in the sky. Then came the first flash of lightning, a jagged tear in the dark clouds, followed an instant later by a crack of thunder so loud it felt like the mountain itself was splitting apart. Panic seized Elara. Her breath caught in her throat, her legs freezing in place. Liam's hand found hers, his grip strong and sure. The casual, easygoing hiker was gone, replaced by the focused athlete he used to be. His eyes scanned the terrain, assessing, calculating. "This way!" he yelled over the wind, pulling her along. He led them, half scrambling, half sliding, off the main ridge, toward a jumble of massive boulders. Just as the first icy pellets of hail began to sting their faces, he found it. A deep alcove, a small cave formed by two house-sized rocks leaning against each other. He pushed her inside and followed, their bodies pressed together in the cramped space as the full fury of the storm broke around them. Wind shrieked, thunder crashed, and lightning illuminated their tiny sanctuary in stark, strobing flashes. Shivering, soaked and breathless, they huddled together, sharing body heat. The sheer terror of the last few minutes had stripped away every last pretense, every unspoken word that had lingered between them for months. He wrapped his arms around her, his body a solid, warm shield against the storm's rage. She could feel the steady, reassuring beat of his heart against her cheek. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his expression raw, his eyes dark with an emotion that made her heart ache. "I wasn't scared of the lightning," he said, his voice husky and low. "I was scared of losing you." His inner thought was a revelation. They say lightning never strikes the same place twice. They're wrong. It struck me the moment I saw her, and it was striking me again right now. Before she could answer, before she could even breathe, his lips were on hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was desperate, hungry, fueled by months of unspoken feelings and the raw adrenaline of their survival. It was a kiss that tasted of rain and fear and a profound, overwhelming relief. She kissed him back with all the certainty she'd been searching for since she'd first set foot on the trail, her hands tangling in his wet hair, pulling him closer. In the heart of the storm, sheltered by ancient rock, they finally found their own safe harbour. The final climb to Katahdin began in the pre-dawn darkness, the beams of their headlamps cutting sharp cones of light through the cold, pine-scented air. They moved in a comfortable, practiced silence, a single unit against the immense challenge of Maine's greatest mountain. The trail was less a path than a puzzle of giant granite boulders, requiring them to hoist each other up, their movements a synchronized dance they had perfected over 2,000 miles. They were no longer two lost people searching for a way forward. They were a team, each the other's anchor and guide. As they cleared the tree line, the first hint of dawn painted the eastern horizon in pale shades of lavender and rose. The wind was a sharp, biting force, but they barely noticed, their focus entirely on the summit that loomed above them. When they finally pulled themselves over the last boulder and saw the iconic weathered sign, a wave of emotion so powerful it buckled Elara's knees washed over them. Katahdin. Northern terminus of the Appalachian Trail. They had made it. They touched the rough carved wood of the sign together, their fingers intertwining. A few other hikers huddled against the rocks cheered for them, their voices thin in the vast emptiness. "Congratulations, Slider and Compass Rose," one shouted, solidifying the identity they had built together. They were the Nobo couple, a small legend in the transient world of the trail. The sun broke free of the horizon, flooding the world below with a spectacular golden light. They stood on the roof of Maine, looking out at an endless sea of mountains and lakes, and then they looked at each other. Liam's eyes were full of a love so deep and certain it took Elara's breath away. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small smooth stone worn into the shape of a heart by some ancient river. He pressed it into her palm. "I came out here to figure out what to do without baseball," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Turns out the answer wasn't a what, it was a who. My dream isn't about pitching anymore, Rose, it's about writing songs and seeing where this path leads, as long as you're on it with me." Tears streamed down Elara's face, freezing on her cheeks. She looked from the stone in her hand to the man in front of her, and for the first time in her life, her future felt absolutely clear. She hadn't needed to find a specific career or a perfectly mapped out plan. She'd needed to find her direction, her true north. "I came here to get away from the world," she whispered, her voice catching. "I ended up finding mine." And as the sun fully illuminated the wild, beautiful world below them, he kissed her, It was a kiss unlike the desperate one in the storm. This one was slow and deep and full of the quiet certainty of a sunrise. It was a kiss that held the memory of every mile, every struggle, and every shared laugh. It was the Katahdin Promise. The Appalachian Trail doesn't give you the answers you think you're looking for. It just gives you the miles, the silence, and the strength to finally ask the right questions. And if you're lucky, it gives you the person you're meant to ask them with for the rest of your life. Embers of Wildflower Hill. The summer of 1895 arrived in the valley like a whispered promise. It settled over Wildflower Hill Farm in waves of golden light that poured through the kitchen windows, illuminating the dance of dust motes in the air. For me, Cora May, each morning was a replica of the last, a litany of chores set to the rhythm of birdsong, and the distant Sunday morning chime of church bells from the town I could see but rarely visited. I was a creature of routine, my world contained by the farm's fences and the sharp, ever-present voice of my guardian, Mrs. Whitmore. "Cora, the bread will burn if you stand there daydreaming," she called from the porch, her voice cutting through the gentle morning symphony like a scythe through wheat. A girl who just turned 18 ought to have more sense than a goose. I flinched, turning from the window to the scent of yeast and warmth. My life was a series of small, contained tasks, kneading dough, churning butter, mending linens. It was a safe life, a debt I was meant to repay with silent obedience. Mrs. Whitmore had taken me in from the county orphanage. It was the place where foundlings like me, left as infants on the church steps, waited for a life to begin. She chose me when I was 5, and she never let me forget that my existence was her act of charity, a debt I was meant to repay with silent obedience. My dreams were an indulgence we couldn't afford. That morning, however, the routine was broken. As I carried a pail of fresh milk toward the cool of the root cellar, a horse and wagon I didn't recognize crested the hill. It was driven by a man whose clothes were not of our valley. He wore a crisp, light-coloured suit, a city hat perched on his head, and his posture was one of easy confidence that seemed alien against the backdrop of our weathered barns and sprawling fields. He pulled his horse to a gentle stop near the porch, his eyes scanning the property with a thoughtful curiosity I'd never seen before. Men here looked at the land for what it could yield: corn, hay, potatoes. This man looked at it as if he were listening to a secret it was telling. He tipped his hat toward Mrs. Whitmore, who stood with her arms crossed, her face a mask of suspicion. "Good morning, madame. My name is Julian Ashford. I'm a surveyor from Boston, looking for the Ashford property line." Mrs. Whitmore's expression sharpened, her eyes narrowing on his face. "Ashford, you say? It's a bold thing, a city Ashford coming back to look at the land your family abandoned. What business could you have here now?" The gentle smile on his face tightened slightly, but he held her gaze. "It remains my family's land, madam, and my business is to survey it. I've been tasked with mapping what was left behind." It was then that he saw me, standing frozen halfway to the cellar, the milk pail heavy in my hands. His gaze was direct, yet kind. It wasn't the appraising look of the farmhands or the dismissive glance of the town gentry. It was a look of genuine, quiet observation. In that moment, a nervous tremor ran through me, and my grip on the pail handle slipped. The pail clattered to the dirt, sending a cascade of white milk and tin cups scattering across the yard. A hot flush of shame burned my cheeks. "Clumsy girl," Mrs. Whitmore snapped, but Julian was already off his wagon before the words had fully landed. He knelt, not minding the dirt on his fine trousers, and began gathering the cups. His hands were long and elegant, yet smudged with what looked like ink stains around the fingers. "It happens to the best of us," he said, his voice low and meant only for me. He handed me the cups, his fingers brushing against mine. His touch was a spark against the cool morning air. "Your hands," he observed softly, looking at my trembling fingers, "shake like autumn leaves." I couldn't find my voice to answer. I could only stare at the ink stains, the kindness in his eyes, at this man who had stepped out of another world and into the middle of my own. Later that evening, long after the supper dishes were cleaned and Mrs. Whitmore was asleep, I sat at my small bedroom window. A single lamp burned in the distance, a point of gold against the deepening indigo of the hills. It was him. Julian had set up his camp near the edge of the Ashford land. I could see his silhouette against the lamplight as he bent over a large drawing board, a pencil moving deftly in his hand. He wasn't conquering the land, he was learning its language, translating its contours onto paper. I watched for what felt like hours. The world outside my window suddenly vast and filled with a thrilling, terrifying possibility. I'd never seen a man who looked at the world as if it was something beautiful to be preserved rather than conquered. And as he worked under the silent watch of the stars, I felt a part of myself, a part I hadn't even known was dormant, begin to stir and awaken. The valley was the same, but for the first time I felt the promise of a different view. The days that followed were filled with a secret current of anticipation. I performed my chores with a new, quiet energy, my senses tuned to the distant sound of Julian's work, the metallic clink of his surveying equipment, the soft thud of a wooden stake being driven into the earth. I found excuses to be outdoors, my eyes always drifting toward the overgrown fields that separated our farm from the forgotten Ashford land. It was during one of these stolen moments, while picking a bunch of wild Queen Anne's lace near the crumbling stone wall of the old mill, that he found me. I was so lost in thought, tracing the delicate web-like pattern of a flower, that I didn't hear him approach. "They look like constellations, don't they?" His voice startled me, and I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. Julian stood there, holding not a tool, but a sketchbook. A gentle smile played on his lips, each one a tiny galaxy. I clutched the wildflowers to my chest. I never thought of it that way. "That's the secret to everything," he said, taking a step closer. "Perspective. The same view can look entirely different depending on where you stand." He opened his sketchbook, and my breath caught. It was filled with breathtakingly detailed drawings, the gnarled trunk of an oak tree, the precise architecture of a dragonfly's wing, the sweep of the valley as seen from the hill. And there, on a fresh page, was a light sketch of the old mill, its stones rendered with a loving, meticulous hand. "You make things beautiful," I whispered, mesmerized. "I don't make them beautiful," he corrected gently. "I just try to see the beauty that's already there." He gestured to the flower in my hand. "May I?" He took out a graphite pencil and turned to a new page in his book. "Let me show you." He guided me to sit on the sun-warmed stone wall, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and the sound of water trickling over stones in the nearby creek. He began to sketch the Queen Anne's lace, explaining the way the light fell, the importance of shadow, the fine art of seeing. To show me a curve, he placed the pencil in my hand and gently enclosed his fingers over mine, guiding my knuckles. A tremor went through me at the contact, the warmth of his skin, the slight pressure of his hand, the shared purpose of creating a line on paper. It was the most intimate touch I had ever known. In that dappled sunlit sanctuary, walls began to crumble, not just the stone ones around us, but the ones I had built around my heart. Emboldened by his kindness, I confessed a secret I had guarded for years. "I can read," I said, the words feeling foreign on my tongue. "Mrs. Whitmore thinks it's a waste of time for a girl. She doesn't know." Julian's eyes lit up with a profound respect that felt more nourishing than any praise I'd ever received. He didn't pity me, he celebrated me. The next afternoon he returned to our spot by the mill. He didn't bring his sketchbook. He brought a small leather-bound book. The gold lettering on the spine read, "The Poetical Works of John Keats." He opened it to a page marked with a pressed violet. "Do you know what beauty is, Cora?" he asked, his voice soft as he read the lines aloud. His voice gave the words a life I'd never imagined. "Beauty is truth. Truth, beauty. That is all ye know on earth, and all ye need to know." He looked up at me, his gaze intense. "It isn't just about pretty things. It's about honesty, sincerity, courage. Beauty is courage made visible." He left the book with me. That night I read Keats by candlelight, the scent of crushed wildflower petals rising from the pages. His poem spoke of nightingales and Grecian urns, of love and loss so profound it made my chest ache. But it was Julian's words that echoed in my mind, courage made visible. With each passing day in our hidden garden of possibility, I felt that courage taking root inside me. He was teaching me about perspective, not just in drawing, but in life. He saw the world as a place of wonder, and when he looked at me, I started to believe I could be a part of it. The warmth of his shoulder brushing against mine as we looked at his sketches, the shared silence broken only by the creek's murmur, the secret knowledge of the book hidden beneath my mattress, these were the seeds of a new world. I had lived in this valley all my life, surrounded by its rolling hills and familiar seasons, but as I told him one late afternoon, my voice trembling with the truth of it, "I've never really seen it until you showed me how to look." The sky had been a deceptive, brilliant blue all day, but as twilight began to bleed across the horizon, a bruised purple stain appeared in the west. The air grew heavy and still, the birds falling silent. I was helping Julian measure the foundation of the old Ashford house, holding one end of his long measuring tape, when the first fat drop of rain hit my cheek, then another, and another. Within moments, the heavens opened. A torrential downpour, cold and violent, swept across the hills. Thunder cracked overhead, a sound so deep it seemed to shake the very bones of the earth. "The barn!" Julian shouted over the roar, grabbing my hand and his satchel of drawings. We ran, slipping on the wet grass, the rain plastering my thin, cotton dress to my skin and his hair to his forehead. We stumbled into the cavernous, hay-scented darkness of the old mill barn, just as another peal of thunder rolled through the valley like the footfalls of a giant. The rain hammered on the wooden roof, a deafening, relentless drumbeat. Inside, the world shrank to just the two of us, surrounded by shadows and the smell of old wood, dry hay, and the approaching storm. A flash of lightning illuminated the space, freezing us for a second in a stark silver tableau, his hand still holding mine, our chests heaving from the run. He let go of my hand, but the warmth lingered. He moved to the large barn doors, peering out at the tempest. "It looks like we'll be here a while." The storm outside seemed to mirror the one gathering inside me. In the close, charged atmosphere of the barn, all pretense fell away. We were no longer surveyor and farm girl, teacher and student. We were just a man and a woman sheltered from the same storm. He turned from the door, his face cast in shadow. "I've been drawing other people's dreams for so long, I forgot I had my own," he said, his voice quiet but resonant in the echoing space. He told me of his life in Boston, of a father who saw architecture as a business of status and wealth, not art. He was meant to design opulent mansions for men he didn't respect, to marry a woman chosen for her family's connections, to live a life that was a perfect, beautiful blueprint of someone else's desires. His vulnerability was a key, unlocking a door in my own heart. I found myself telling him things I had never spoken aloud, of the cold loneliness of the orphanage, of the gnawing fear of being unwanted that had been my constant companion. "Sometimes I feel invisible," I confessed, my voice barely a whisper, "like a ghost in my own life." He moved closer, his expression achingly tender in the gloom. You are the least invisible person I have ever met, Cora. Another flash of lightning lit his feet, and in that split second, I saw the raw emotion there, a longing that mirrored my own. He raised his hand, his fingers gently brushing a rain-soaked strand of hair from my cheek. The touch was electric. The thunder outside seemed to beat in time with my own heart. He leaned in and the world stopped. His lips met mine, and it was nothing like the chaste fantasies I might have entertained. It was tender and desperate, a question and an answer all at once. It tasted of rain and salt, the rain on his skin and the single tear that escaped my eye and traced a path down my face. The kiss deepened, breaking a dam inside me. All the yearning, all the unspoken hopes, all the feelings I had no names for rushed to the surface in a wave of consuming heat. He pulled me closer, his arms wrapping around me, holding me as if I were the most precious thing in the world. In the heart of the storm, I felt utterly, completely safe and yet more thrillingly endangered than I had ever been. He broke the kiss only to press his lips to my neck, his breath hot against my rain-cooled skin. My head fell back, a silent surrender to the sensations he was awakening. With a groan that seemed pulled from his very soul, he guided me backward and we sank down into a pile of soft, sweet-smelling hay. The rustle of it was a whisper joining the drumming of the rain on the roof. His hands, the same hands that could render the world with such delicate precision on paper, were now learning the lines of my body with a desperate, wonderful urgency. He unlaced the bodice of my dress, his fingers fumbling slightly, a sign of a passion that overrode his usual grace. The cool air hit my skin as he peeled away the damp cotton, his gaze following the path of his hands. There was no shame in his eyes, only a profound, breathtaking reverence that made me feel beautiful for the first time in my life. He lowered his head, his lips tracing a fiery path along my collarbone, down into the valley between my breasts. I gasped, my fingers tangling in his damp hair, pulling him closer. This was desire. This was a choice. Each touch was a question he was asking, and my every shuddering breath was an answer. My own hands grew bold, exploring the hard planes of his back, the surprising strength in his shoulders. I helped him with the buttons of his shirt, my fingers brushing against the solid warmth of his chest. When our skin met, it was like lightning, a jolt of pure feeling that arced between us. He was real, solid, and warm beneath my hands. When our bodies finally joined, it was a moment of absolute breathtaking clarity. Sharp gasp of pain and pleasure left my lips, a sound that was instantly swallowed by his kiss. He held himself still above me, his eyes locked on mine, waiting. In that gaze I gave him my trust, and he met it with a tenderness that shattered me. He moved, slowly at first, a rhythm that matched the steady, insistent rain outside, a rhythm that was building a new world inside the forgotten barn. It was not a surrender, but a claiming of myself, of him, of this one perfect stolen moment in time where we were the only two souls in existence. The hay pricked my skin, the thunder rolled in the distance, and the only thing I could feel was him, a glorious, undeniable presence that filled all my senses. Later, as we lay tangled in limbs and hay, the storm outside having softened to a steady rhythmic drumming, I traced the line of his jaw. My voice, when I found it, was a raw whisper against his chest. You make me feel like I exist. He gathered me closer, his arm a solid weight of possession and protection around me. I could feel the steady beat of his heart against my cheek. You make me feel like I'm finally building something for myself. Just then, a faint, sharp sound cut through the rain. Cora! Cora! Where are you? It was Mrs. Whitmore's voice, a cold blade of reality slicing through our sanctuary. The spell was broken. I understood then that love was not gentle. It was a wildfire that consumed everything you thought you knew about yourself. leaving you raw and exposed and utterly transformed in its wake. And as I gathered my clothes in the shadows, the scent of hay and rain and him clinging to my skin, I knew that I could never go back to the girl I was before the storm. The world after the storm felt muted, holding its breath. For 3 days, a profound silence settled over Wildflower Hill. Julian was gone. His camp was still there, a lonely canvas tent by the woods, but he did not appear at our garden by the mill, nor did his lamp burn late into the night. An agonizing knot of fear and doubt tightened in my chest. The memory of the barn, the thunder, his touch, his whispered confessions felt like a fever dream. Had I imagined it all? On the evening of the 3rd day, my anxiety became unbearable. After Mrs. Whitmore had retired, her snores a rhythmic counterpoint to my frantic heartbeat, I slipped out of the house. A sliver of moon offered just enough light to guide my path toward his camp. My bare feet were silent on the damp earth. I saw him as I cleared the tree line. He was packing. His surveying tools were already boxed, his drawing board wrapped in oilcloth. He was folding his tent with a grim mechanical efficiency. My heart plummeted. He was leaving. "Julian?" My voice was a fragile thing in the vast quiet. He froze, his back to me. When he finally turned, his face was a portrait of anguish. He looked pale, haunted. "Cora, you shouldn't be here." "You're leaving," I stated, the words tasting like ash. Without a word. "I had to go to town," he said, his voice strained. "There was a telegram." He wouldn't meet my eyes. He reached for his coat, which lay draped over a crate, and as he lifted it, a single white envelope fluttered to the ground. Neither of us moved for a second. It lay there between us, stark against the dark grass. I bent and picked it up. My fingers recognized the expensive, crisp paper. It wasn't addressed to him. It was an invitation. My eyes scanned the elegant, looping script, and the words seemed to burn themselves into my mind. "Mr. and Mrs. Alistair Thornfield request the pleasure of your company to celebrate the engagement of their daughter, Miss Margaret Thornfield and Mr. Julian Ashford." The air left my lungs in a single silent gasp. The world tilted, the trees swaying as if they would fall. I looked from the pristine white card to his tormented face, and a cold, sharp rage I had never known began to smoulder within me. "Was I just another landscape for you to survey and abandon?" I asked, my voice trembling with a fury that was utterly new to me. I held up the invitation. "Was this part of your study? The naive farm girl? Another pretty sketch to add to your collection?" "No, Cora, no, it's not like that," he said, stepping toward me, his hands outstretched. "Please, let me explain." "Explain this." I thrust the invitation at him. The paper tore slightly in my grip. His desperation was palpable, his words tumbling out in a torrent of misery. "It's an arrangement. My family's. It was made years ago. My father's business is failing. Her family is wealthy. It's a merger, not a marriage. It's about obligation and debt. It has nothing to do with love, nothing to do with how I feel about you." "How you feel about me?" I laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "You feel so much that you are going to disappear without a trace?" "I didn't know what to do," he cried, his voice cracking. "I came back from town today to pack my things and tell you, I swear it, this life, this engagement, it's a prison. You, Cora, you are the only real thing in it. I would give up everything for you, but I have nothing to give. My name, my inheritance, it's all tied to this." His words, meant to be a comfort, were a confirmation of the terrible truth. I was his secret, his escape, the wildflower he could appreciate in a hidden garden, but could never wear on his lapel in the drawing rooms of Boston. The storm in the barn was our sanctuary, but it was also our cage, a place outside of his real life. I stood there, the torn invitation clutched in my hand. The single candle in my distant bedroom window, the only warm light in a world that had gone cold. He was trapped, yes, but he was asking me to be trapped with him, to accept the stolen moments, the hidden affections, the life lived in the shadows of his obligations. And in that moment of devastating clarity, I realized the choice wasn't his to make alone. It was mine. The girl who felt invisible was gone. The woman standing before him would not be someone's secret. She would not trade one cage for another, no matter how beautifully gilded. Love without courage is just another cage, Julian, I said, my voice steady now with a resolve forged in the fire of this betrayal. And I've lived in enough cages for one lifetime. I dropped the torn letter at his feet, turned, and walked back toward the farmhouse, not looking back. I didn't hear him call my name. I heard only the sound of my own ragged breathing, and the distant lonely sound of his horse being hitched to his wagon, preparing to depart. A week passed. The air turned crisp, carrying the first hints of autumn. The vibrant greens of Wildflower Hill began to be tinged with strokes of gold and rust, the world changing its colours around me. I changed with it. The searing pain of Julian's departure cooled into a hard, clear resolve. I did not weep. Instead, I read. I devoured the book of Keats, not for the romance, but for the strength I found in its pages. I helped Mrs. Whitmore with the chores, my movements sure and steady, my silence no longer one of meekness, but of contemplation. During that week, I did something I had never dared to do. I hitched our old mare to the cart and drove myself into town. I walked into the county schoolhouse and spoke to the headmistress, a stern-looking woman named Mrs. Gable. I told her I could read and write, that I knew my numbers, and that I wanted to learn how to teach. I showed her my penmanship. She looked at me over her spectacles, her gaze sharp and appraising. She saw not a charity case, but a mind hungry for purpose. She offered me a position, assisting her, with the chance to become a teacher in the small school in the next county come spring. It wasn't a grand life, but it would be my own. I returned to the farm feeling a sense of ownership over my own destiny for the first time. I had a plan that did not involve waiting for a man to choose me. I was choosing myself. Then at dawn on the 8th day, as the morning mist was lifting from the valley like a slow-rising curtain, I saw a figure walking up the path. It was Julian. He was on foot, his fine city clothes replaced by simple, sturdy trousers and a worn shirt. He carried no surveying equipment, no sketchbooks. He looked tired, but his eyes were clear. He didn't come to the farmhouse. He went to our garden by the old mill, as if he knew that was where he might find me. And he was right. I was already there, waiting. I had been drawn there by some instinct, a feeling that our story was not yet finished. He stopped a few feet from me, his hands empty at his sides. "I broke the engagement," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I spoke to my father. I told him I would not be a part of the arrangement. He disowned me. I have forfeited my inheritance, my position, everything." He took a breath, his gaze unwavering. "I came to ask you to come to Boston with me, Cora. I have nothing but my hands and my heart to offer you. I can find work. I can draw, I can build. We would have nothing, but we would have each other. A year ago, a week ago, his words would have been a rescue, a dream come true, but I was not the same girl. I smiled, a small, sad but powerful smile. "I cannot go to Boston as the woman you support, Julian," I said, and I saw a flash of pain in his eyes before I continued, "but I will go as your partner." I told him about my meeting with Mrs. Gable, about the teaching position, about the life I had begun to build for myself in the ashes of my heartbreak. "I have my own future now," I explained, "my own work to do." Understanding dawned on his face, replaced by a look of profound, breathtaking admiration. This was the perspective he had taught me to see. He wasn't saving me. We were meeting as equals. two people who had chosen to dismantle their old lives to build a new one. "Then we shall go together," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You will teach, and I will build. We will make our own fortune, our own home." He stepped forward and took my hands in his. His touch was no longer just a spark of desire. It was a steady, grounding force. "Let me come with you." And so we chose each other, not out of dependency or desperation, but out of a shared vision for a life built on courage. The next morning we stood on the platform at the train station. I carried a small travelling bag containing a change of clothes, the Book of Keats, and a single pressed wildflower from our garden. From the farmhouse window on the hill, I could just make out the silhouette of Mrs. Whitmore watching us go. I felt not anger, but a strange sort of pity for her, for a life lived within such rigid fences. As the train pulled away with a great hiss of steam and a hopeful whistle, I pressed my face to the window and watched Wildflower Hill grow smaller in the distance. The girl who had never dared to dream beyond the next sunrise was gone forever. In her place sat a woman who had learned that the greatest act of love is not surrendering yourself to another, but becoming fully yourself, and then choosing to share that self with someone brave enough to do the same. Julian's hand found mine, his fingers lacing through my own. It felt not like a rescue, but like a promise, that we would build our own garden wherever we planted ourselves and tend it together. And as the train carried us toward an uncertain future, the morning light pouring in, I knew we were finally heading home. When the corn turns gold. The Nebraska air in late April carried the scent of possibility. It smelled of damp, overturned earth, of lilac bushes teasing their first buds, and of the clean, crisp promise of a spring that had finally wrestled winter into submission. 17-year-old Hannah Callahan hummed a tuneless melody, her fingers nimble as she pinned her father's work shirts to the clothesline. The wind, a constant companion on the plains, billowed the fabric like a ship's sails, and with each gust the faint, reassuring rumble of a tractor reached her from the neighbouring farm. Eli's tractor. It was the background music to her entire life, a steady thrumming that meant the world was turning as it should. She smiled, her thoughts drifting from the chores at hand to the dress hanging in her closet. A cascade of periwinkle chiffon she'd found at a thrift store and altered with her mother's help. Prom was 2 weeks away. 2 weeks until she and Ryan would step into the brightly decorated community centre, leaving their small-town lives behind for one magical night. Ryan, with his easy smile and quarterback confidence, was her ticket to the kind of senior year memories she'd seen in movies, the kind she craved with a fierce teenage ache. Her phone buzzed in the pocket of her jeans. She wiped a damp hand on her thigh before answering, her smile widening when she saw his name. "Hey, you!" "Hannah." "Hey!" Ryan's voice wasn't warm and teasing like usual. It was flat, distant, like a call coming from across an ocean, not from the next town over. "Listen, I need to tell you something about prom." A knot of ice formed in Hannah's stomach. The gentle breeze suddenly felt sharp, invasive. "Okay." There was a pause, filled with the crackle of static and the sound of him clearing his throat. "I'm taking Jessica instead. We've just been talking a lot, and it just makes more sense." The world tilted on its axis. Jessica Riley, whose locker was 3 down from hers, whose laughter always seemed a little too loud in the hallways. The words didn't compute, they just collided. Makes more sense. The phrase was a clinical blade severing the future she had so carefully constructed in her mind. Her fingers went slack. Denim shirt, still damp, slipped from the line and fell into the patch of dirt below. "Hannah, are you there?" "Why?" The word was a ghost, barely audible over the sudden silence of the wind chimes on the porch, which had ceased their gentle song. It's what's happening, okay? I'm sorry." He wasn't sorry. His tone was one of inconvenience, of a task being checked off a list. Hannah didn't say goodbye. She just ended the call, her thumb pressing the screen with a trembling finality. She stared at the fallen shirt, a dark blue blot against the brown earth. How do you prepare for the ground to disappear beneath your feet? For a moment, she felt nothing but a profound, hollow emptiness. Then came the heat, a flush of humiliation that climbed her neck and burned her cheeks. Every conversation in the school hallway, every shared glance over lunch, every whispered plan for their future, it all replayed in her mind, now tainted with fraud. She unpinned the rest of the laundry with robotic movements, her hand shaking so badly she dropped 2 more clothespins. She didn't bother to pick them up. Inside the house, the familiar scent of her mother's baking was suffocating. She couldn't face the questions in her mother's eyes. She slipped out the back door and ran, not toward the house but toward the cavernous refuge of the barn. The heavy wooden door groaned open and slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing in the vast dusty space. Hannah climbed the ladder to the hayloft, her sanctuary since she was a little girl. It was where she'd hidden from thunderstorms and creed over scraped knees. Now it was where she would hide from a broken heart. The golden hour light of late afternoon streamed through the high, dirty window, illuminating millions of dancing dust motes. The air was thick with the sweet, earthy smell of old hay and dry wood. She collapsed onto a bale, the rough straw scratching her arms, and finally let the tears come. They were hot and silent, carving paths through the dust on her cheeks. Outside the world went on. A dog barked, a car passed on the gravel road. And then a new sound, or rather the absence of one. The steady, comforting rumble of Eli's tractor had gone silent. The day was over. For Eli, it was just the end of another day of work. For Hannah, it felt like the end of everything. She pulled her knees to her chest, buried her face in her arms, and wept as the last of the golden light faded to a bruised, lonely purple. 2 days later, the sky opened up. A cold spring rain fell in relentless sheets, turning the farm's dirt lanes into muddy rivers and drumming a sombre, hypnotic rhythm on the tin roof of the Parker family barn. Hannah and her father had just finished delivering a load of feed, and she'd lingered, watching the storm from the shelter of the massive doorway, not yet ready to face the quiet sympathy waiting for her at home. The news about Ryan and Jessica had spread through the school's social ecosystem like wildfire, and she felt as though she were wearing her heartbreak like a scarlet letter. The scent of rain-soaked earth mingled with the sweet, heavy smell of hay and livestock. A gust of wind drove a fine mist into her face, and she shivered, hugging her thin cardigan tighter. "You'll catch your death out here." The voice made her jump. Eli Parker emerged from the gloom of a nearby stall, wiping his hands on a rag. He was taller than she remembered, his shoulders broadened by years of farm work. His flannel shirt was worn soft at the elbows, and his hair was a perpetual mess of dusty blonde curls. He'd always just been Eli, the quiet boy next door, a fixture, like the old oak tree that marked the property line between their farms. "Just watching the rain," she mumbled, looking away. He didn't press, he just stood beside her, his presence surprisingly solid. The silence between them wasn't awkward, but filled with the steady drumming of the rain. Barn cats, sleek and confident, wound around their ankles, purring with a rumbling contentment that Hannah envied. "Heard about Ryan," Eli said finally, his voice low. He wasn't looking at her, but at the downpour. "He's an idiot." It was simple, direct, and more comforting than any of the pitying looks she'd received from her friends. A small watery smile touched her lips. Yeah, he is. He shrugged out of his flannel jacket. Here, you're shivering. Before she could protest, he draped it over her shoulders. It was heavy and ridiculously large on her, smelling of sawdust, soap, and something that was uniquely Eli. The warmth seeped into her skin, a small shield against the chill inside and out. Thanks, she whispered, pulling it closer. They stood like that for another minute, watching the storm. Eli's awkwardness was a kind of gentle armour. He fidgeted with the rag in his hands, his gaze shifting from the rain to the barn rafters and back again. I know it's probably stupid, he began, his words hesitant, and it's none of my business, but you shouldn't miss our prom because Ryan's an idiot. Hannah's breath caught. She turned to look at him, really look at him for the first time in what felt like years. His eyes, a shade of blue that mirrored the summer sky, were fixed on her with a startling sincerity. What are you saying, Eli? He swallowed, a flicker of nerves crossing his face. I don't do dances. They terrify me, to be honest. All those people, he gestured vaguely with the rag, but you shouldn't have to stay home. You shouldn't have to watch from the sidelines. He took a breath. So if you wanted to go, I'd take you. The question hung in the rain-soaked air. Hannah stared at him, a mix of surprise and a strange burgeoning gratitude swelling in her chest. Are you asking me to prom, Eli Parker? A faint blush coloured his neck. Just as friends, he added quickly, as if to give her an easy out. So you can go, wear your dress, so he doesn't get to win, that's all. So he doesn't get to win. The thought resonated deep inside her. It was a lifeline. It wasn't about romance or finding a new date. It was about reclaiming a piece of her stolen joy. It was about defiance, and it was being offered by the last person she ever would have expected. She noticed his hands, the ones he was nervously twisting the rag in. They were calloused from work, the knuckles scarred, but his movements were careful, gentle. She'd seen those hands fix fences, calm a spooked calf and replant her mother's peonies after a storm had flattened them. She looked up and caught him watching her, a question in his eyes, and he quickly looked away. In that fleeting glance, she saw something more than just neighbourly concern. She saw a deep, quiet kindness she had always taken for granted. A loud clap of thunder rumbled overhead, shaking the old barn. Hannah didn't flinch. For the first time in 2 days, she felt anchored. She nodded slowly, the flannel jacket a warm, comforting weight on her shoulders. Okay, Eli, she said, her voice steadier than it had been all week. As friends. They sat down on a bale of hay, the comfortable silence returning, the rain a steady beat against the roof. But something had changed. An unspoken current had shifted in the air between them, as tangible and electric as the storm raging outside. Prom night arrived on a wave of warm, stardusted air. The chime of the doorbell sent a flutter of nerves through Hannah's stomach, a mix of apprehension and a new, unfamiliar anticipation. Taking one last look in the hall mirror at the girl in the periwinkle chiffon dress, she took a deep breath and opened the door. Eli stood on her porch, framed by the deepening twilight. He was wearing a dark suit that was clearly his father's, the shoulders a little too wide, but it only served to emphasize his own solid frame. His hair was meticulously combed, though a stubborn blonde curl was already staging a rebellion at his temple. In his hands he held a small clear box containing a wrist corsage of white rosebuds. He looked from her face down to her dress and back up again, his own awe genuine and unguarded. Wow, he breathed, his voice soft. Hannah, you look beautiful. I mean, you always do, but wow. A warm, pleasant blush crept up her neck. You clean up pretty well yourself, Parker, she teased gently. This is for you, he said, looking down at the box in his hand as if just remembering it. With hands that trembled slightly, he opened it and carefully slid the corsage onto her wrist. His touch was hesitant, but his calloused fingertips sent a tiny, unexpected spark up her arm. Her father appeared in the doorway behind her, giving Eli a firm, appraising look before breaking into a smile. "Have a good time, you two," he said, clapping Eli on the shoulder. "Drive safe, son." The ride to the community centre in his old pickup truck was quiet, but it was a comfortable silence, filled with the soft rock station on the radio and the vast starry sky stretching out on all sides. When they arrived, the familiar gymnasium had been transformed with surprising magic. Glimmering string lights were woven through the basketball hoops, and paper flowers adorned the walls. The floor, polished to a high shine, reflected the lights like a dark, still lake. Eli, clearly out of his element, navigated the loud music and social chaos with a deep-set anxiety she could see in the tight line of his jaw. Yet he did it. For her. He got her punch, made stilted conversation with her friends, and stood by her side like a steadfast guardian. And she found herself watching him, not her classmates. She watched the way he treated people with a simple, unassuming respect, the way his eyes would find hers across the room, as if to check if she was okay. Then the DJ slowed things down. The opening chords of Unchained Melody drifted through the gym. Eli stiffened. "We don't have to," he said quickly. "I want to," Hannah heard herself say, and she meant it. She took his hand and led him toward the dance floor. He placed one hand on her waist, his touch light, almost reverent. She rested her other hand on his shoulder. As the song swelled, they found a rhythm, and she rested her head against his chest. She could feel the steady thumping beat of his heart beneath her ear, a rhythm far more grounding than the music. His hand on her back was firm, protective. When did his shoulders get so broad? When did his smile start making my stomach flutter? The questions bloomed in her mind, startling and bright. This wasn't the boy next door anymore. This was Eli. She tilted her head back to look at him. He was already looking at her, and the space between them seemed to shrink, charged with a potent energy. He looked from her eyes to her lips. It was going to happen. A kiss with Ryan had always felt like something for an audience, a confirmation of status. This felt private, sacred. A kiss from Eli, she realised with a jolt that went straight through her, wouldn't be a conquest, it would be a question and answer. An entire conversation without a single word. It would mean something. He leaned in, his intention clear, his breath warm on her skin. "Hey guys, you have to see this." A classmate clapped Eli on the shoulder, shattering the moment into 1,000 pieces. The spell was broken. They sprang apart, a flush of colour rising in both their faces. The rest of the night passed in a daze, but the memory of that almost kiss lingered, a shimmering, unspoken promise between them. When they walked out into the cool, silent night, everything familiar felt breathtakingly new. The summer that followed was dipped in honey and gold. The almost kiss at prom had unlocked something between them, a quiet understanding that didn't need words. Their days fell into a comfortable sun-drenched rhythm. They worked side by side, Anna helping on the Parker farm when her own chores were done, Eli showing up with his father's tiller to help her dad break new ground for a garden. They were a team. They shared lunches under the shade of the ancient oak tree that stood sentinel between their properties, their conversation easy and rambling. They talked about everything and nothing, the price of soybeans, the best way to mend a fence, their secret childhood dreams. Hannah learned that Eli wanted to experiment with no-till farming, to preserve the topsoil his grandfather had cherished. She saw the passion in his eyes when he talked about the land, a fierce, protective love she recognized in her own heart. He was not simple, he was rooted. Their stolen glances across the pews at Sunday service were charged with a sweet, simmering tension. One evening, as twilight settled and the fireflies began their blinking dance, he took her hand as they walked back from the treehouse, their childhood hideout. He didn't say anything, just laced his fingers through hers, and it felt more significant than 1,000 flowery speeches. This slow, patient blooming was more real than any whirlwind romance she had ever imagined. Then in late July, the mail truck delivered the future. Thick envelopes arrived for Hannah, one after another. She was accepted to State University, a sprawling campus 3 hours away, with a full scholarship for their pre-law program. It was the dream she had nurtured for years. A way out. A path to a life bigger than the one she knew. Her parents were ecstatic, their pride a palpable force in the house. The sound of combine harvesters filled the air, the dust of the early harvest swirling in the thick afternoon heat. One sweltering afternoon, Hannah was inside shelling peas while her parents talked on the porch, their voices drifting through the open kitchen window. Eli had just dropped off a crate of sun-warmed tomatoes from his mother's garden and was lingering by the steps, about to say goodbye. "She's going to do great things," Hannah's mother said, her voice full of love and ambition for her daughter. "She's so smart, too smart for this small town, for this life." Hannah froze, a pea pod held halfway to the bowl. She knew her mother didn't mean it unkindly. It was a statement of pride. But she chanced to look out the window and saw Eli's posture change. He'd been leaning against the railing, a relaxed smile on his face, but now he stood up straight, his shoulders tight. He didn't look at her parents. He just gave a short clipped nod, murmured something she couldn't hear, and walked away, his stride long and purposeful. He didn't look back. He started to pull away after that. The shared lunches became less frequent. His replies to her texts grew shorter. He was always busy, always had an excuse. The easy warmth between them was replaced by a strained, painful distance. The unspoken thing that had blossomed in the summer sun was now withering in a drought of his own making. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. She found him at dusk, checking the irrigation lines in a field that bordered their property. "Eli, what's wrong?" she asked, her voice pleading. "Why are you pulling away from me?" He wouldn't meet her eyes, focusing instead on a stubborn sprinkler head. "Nothing's wrong, Hannah. Summer's almost over. You're heading off to a new life." This isn't just about summer," she said, her heart aching. "You know that." He finally looked at her, and his expression was shuttered, guarded. The vulnerability she'd seen at prom was gone, replaced by a mask of indifference. "It was fun, Hannah, that's all. We had a good time." The words were a physical blow. Fun. He was reducing their entire golden summer, the slow dance, the held hands, the shared dreams, to a simple pastime. It was Ryan all over again, but 1,000 times worse, because this time she'd let her heart believe it was real. His internal struggle was invisible to her. She couldn't see his fear, couldn't hear the voice in his head telling him that loving her meant letting her go, that a simple farmer had no business holding back a girl with the world at her feet. All she saw was rejection. Tears blurred her vision. "I can't believe you," she whispered, her voice thick with hurt. She turned and ran, not to the barn and not to the house, but into the sprawling cornfield maze that separated their farms, a place they had played hide-and-seek in as children. The stalks were high above her head, their dry leaves scratching at her arms and face. She ran until her lungs burned, until she was deep inside the green and gold labyrinth. She finally stumbled to a stop, surrounded on all sides, the setting sun casting long, disorienting shadows. She was completely and utterly lost, in more ways than one. The first month of college was a blur of crowded lecture halls, unfamiliar faces, and a profound sense of displacement. Hannah went through the motions, attending classes and joining study groups, but her heart remained in Nebraska, lost somewhere in a cornfield. The city felt loud and impersonal, the people disconnected from the earth and from each other. She missed the scent of hay, the rumble of a tractor, the vast open sky. She missed Eli. She drove home for the annual harvest festival in early October, craving a dose of familiarity. The town square was alive with the sights and sounds of autumn. Fiddle music mingled with the laughter of children, and the crisp air was fragrant with wood smoke, cinnamon, and roasting corn. Golden leaves drifted down from the maple trees, carpeting the ground in a riot of colour. Hannah, wrapped in a cosy sweater, felt like a tourist in her own life. She saw familiar faces, but the conversations were stilted. Everyone wanted to know about the big city, about her new life, a life that felt increasingly like a costume she was wearing. Then she saw him. Eli was on the main stage, standing next to the town mayor. It was time for the charity pie auction, a festival tradition. The final item was a legendary sour cream raisin pie made from his grandmother's recipe. The bidding was fierce, but Eli outbid everyone, paying a staggering amount for his own family's creation. The mayor announced that all the proceeds from that pie would go directly to the Morrison family, whose farm had been hit hard by a hailstorm over the summer. A wave of warmth spread through Hannah's chest, chasing away some of the lonely chill. She wasn't just watching a boy win an auction, she was seeing the man he was. A man of quiet character, of deep-seated loyalty to his community, of a generosity that didn't require an audience. Her mother's words echoed in her mind, too smart for this life, and for the first time she knew they were wrong. There was a different kind of intelligence, a wisdom of the heart and the land, and Eli had it in spades. She knew where she had to go. She slipped away from the festival crowd and walked the familiar path toward the property line, toward the old oak tree that housed their childhood hideout. She climbed the worn wooden slats nailed into the trunk, her movements sure and steady. He was there. He was sitting on the floor of the treehouse, his back against the far wall, staring out at the festival lights twinkling in the distance. He looked up as she climbed inside, his expression a mixture of surprise and sorrow. "I saw what you did," she said softly, sitting across from him, with the pie. He just shrugged, his gaze dropping to the floorboards. The Morrisons needed it. The air was thick with unspoken words, with the ghosts of their summer and the pain of their autumn. Hannah decided she was done with ghosts. "I thought I needed to leave everything behind to find myself, to grow up," she began, her voice gaining strength with every word. "I thought success meant getting as far away from here as possible, but I was wrong. Some roots are worth keeping. Some lives are big enough right where they are." Eli looked up, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I heard your mum that day," he confessed, his voice rough. "She was right. You have so much potential. I was so afraid of holding you back, of being the anchor that kept your ship in the harbour, that I almost let you slip away. I thought that was the right thing to do." The right thing? Hannah's heart ached for his misplaced nobility. "Eli, the right thing is being honest. The right thing is fighting for what you want. Love isn't about where you end up. It's about who stands beside you along the way. I don't want a life that you're not standing in." The truth, raw and beautiful, settled between them. She told him about her decision, one that had been solidifying for weeks. She was transferring, not back home, but to the state's agricultural college, only an hour away. She was changing her major from pre-law to sustainable agriculture. She wasn't giving up her ambition, she was planting it in the soil that felt like home. He stared at her, his face a canvas of disbelief, hope, and dawning joy. He crossed the small space in a single movement, kneeling in front of her. He gently cupped her face in his calloused hands. "Hannah," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I love you. I think I've loved you my whole life." Tears of her own streamed down her face, but these were tears of homecoming. "I know," she smiled. "I think I've known all along, too." Under the same canopy of stars where they had almost kissed months before, he leaned in and finally closed the distance. The kiss was not the fumbling exploration of teenagers, but a deep, certain claiming. It tasted of wood smoke and cinnamon, of autumn and forever. It was a promise, a harvest, a coming home. They returned to the festival hand in hand. The fiddle music was playing a lively tune, and he pulled her into the swirl of dancers by the bonfire. As they moved together, their steps finally in sync, Hannah knew their future was still an unploughed field, full of uncertainty and hard work. But for the first time she wasn't afraid. Their love wasn't a grand, loud declaration. It had grown quietly, like corn in rich Nebraska soil, its roots deepening unseen until one day she realized it had become as essential as breath, as strong as the earth, and as enduring as the prairie sky. Coming home wasn't about giving up on a dream. It was about discovering her biggest dream had been waiting patiently next door all along. Vaulting Hearts in Paris. The light in the Olympic Village Athlete Lounge was the colour of old honey, a thick golden hour glow that seemed to suspend the dust motes in time. It was a strange, temporary peace in a city thrumming with the frantic energy of 1,000 dreams. Avery Monroe felt none of it. For her, there was only the cold blue light of her tablet, where a video of her last practice vault played on a silent, unforgiving loop. Her shoulders, sculpted by a decade of discipline, were knotted with a tension that had nothing to do with her muscles. She watched the ghost of herself on the screen, the explosive sprint, the perfect plant of the pole, the violent, beautiful bend, and the upward swing. But her eyes were fixed on the apex of the arc, that millisecond of weightless hesitation before gravity remembered its claim. It was there, in that sliver of time between flight and fall, that she lived. It was there she was most alive and most alone. The Americans. All power, no grace. The voice, sharp and accented, cut through her concentration. It belonged to a rival coach from a European team, holding court with a small group nearby. He didn't look at her, but the words were aimed like arrows. They throw themselves at the sky and pray. Avery's jaw tightened. She'd heard it all before, the whispers that she was a machine, a product of a brutal training regimen, lacking the artistry of her competitors. She didn't have the energy to be angry. She just sank deeper into her chair, pulling the invisible cloak of her focus tighter around her. Or maybe, a new voice slid into the space, smooth and calm with a hint of a British accent. Some people mistake focus for fear. I prefer to call it preparation. Avery looked up. A man stood there holding 2 mugs of coffee, the steam coiling into the gilded light. He was tall, with the lean, powerful build of an equestrian. His dark hair tousled as if he'd just run his hands through it. But it was his eyes that held her, a startling clear green, crinkled at the corners with an easy warmth that felt entirely out of place in this high-strung environment. He offered her a small lopsided smile and nodded toward the coach. "Donkeys, you'll find, often have the loudest bray." He set one of the mugs down on her table without asking. The simple gesture felt both impossibly bold and profoundly kind. "Callum Hawthorne," he said, extending a hand. His grip was firm, his palm calloused. "Avery Monroe," she replied, her voice huskier than she intended. "I know," he said, his smile widening slightly. "The girl who defies gravity." He took a sip from his own mug, his gaze lingering on her tablet. "You know, the horses I work with teach me something every day. Sometimes the strongest ones are the most afraid of falling." The observation struck her with such unnerving accuracy that she felt a flicker of something other than pressure for the first time in weeks. It wasn't pity in his eyes, but a deep, knowing empathy. He saw past the athlete, past the machine, and glimpsed the trembling human heart within. He was from a different world, dressage, a sport of contained elegance and unspoken communication between man and beast. His world was one of patient control, hers was a 4-second explosion of controlled chaos. He exuded a disarming ease that she had long ago sacrificed at the altar of perfection. "I'm not afraid of falling," she said, the defensive words tasting like a lie on her tongue. "I'm afraid of not flying high enough." Callum held her gaze, the golden light shifting across his face, illuminating the compassion there. The distant muffled sound of a marching band practicing for the opening ceremony drifted through the floor-to-ceiling windows, a reminder of the spectacle waiting just outside their door. The weight of it all, the unspoken pressure of nations and lifetimes of effort, settled back onto Avery's shoulders. "The whole world will be watching tomorrow night," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "Then we should find a better view," he said, his tone suddenly conspiratorial. "The television doesn't do it justice. The energy, the light, it's electric." He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a low, inviting murmur. "I know a place. A rooftop just beyond the perimeter. No cameras, no coaches, no braying donkeys. Just the Paris skyline and the best view of the rehearsal fireworks you'll ever see." It was a reckless invitation. They were supposed to be sequestered, focused, resting. Fraternizing with another athlete, especially one from a different sport and country, was an unnecessary distraction. Every part of her training, every instinct honed for competition, screamed at her to say no, to retreat back to the safety of her solitude and the cold, hard data on her screen. But the way he looked at her, as if she were a person, not a performance metric, was a current pulling her toward an unknown shore. For a decade her life had been a narrow path, a runway leading to a single crossbar. He was offering a detour, a moment to simply look up at the sky without wanting to conquer it. She looked from his open, waiting face to the looping video of herself, forever suspended between flight and failure. Maybe, just for one night, she could choose a different kind of height. "Okay," Avery heard herself say, the single word a small rebellion. "Show me." The Château de Versailles was a ghost at twilight. The throngs of tourists had vanished, leaving behind gardens that breathed a quiet, ancient story into the cool evening air. The only sounds were the crunch of gravel under their feet and the distant meditative bubbling of a fountain. Away from the relentless modernity of the Olympic village, time itself seemed to soften. "I can't believe you got us in," Avery whispered, gazing at the palace, its windows like dark, sleeping eyes under a lavender sky. "My grandfather knows the head groundskeeper," Callum said with a shrug, though the twinkle in his eye suggested a more charming form of persuasion had been involved. A shared love for heirloom roses and vintage Bordeaux can open many doors in France. He led her not toward the grand geometric lawns, but to a quieter, more secluded area, the royal stables. The air grew rich with the scent of hay, leather, and the warm, earthy smell of horses. In a paddock, a magnificent mare with a coat the colour of polished mahogany blinked at them with large, liquid eyes. "This is Isabeau," Callum said, stroking the horse's velvety nose. "She's retired, a queen in her own right." He took Avery's hand and her breath hitched at the casual, confident touch. He placed it gently on the mare's powerful neck. The animal's warmth radiated through her palm, a steady, living heat. "Feel that? That's pure strength. But it's a quiet strength. You have to earn her trust." For the next hour under Callum's patient guidance, Avery did just that. He taught her how to approach, how to speak in a low, soothing tone, how to read the subtle flick of an ear. She, who commanded metal and fiberglass to bend to her will, found herself humbled by the simple, profound connection with another living being. It required a different kind of strength, Not explosive power, but receptive stillness. Later, as darkness began to settle in earnest, she found an empty stretch of lawn, a makeshift runway. "My turn," she said, a playful challenge in her voice. She picked up a long, sturdy branch that had fallen from a plane tree. "The pole is an extension of you," she began, her tone shifting as she stepped into her own world. "It's not a tool you use, it's a partner. You give it your energy, your speed, your trust, and it gives you flight." She walked him through the fundamentals, the grip, the plant, the initial swing. He was endearingly clumsy. His long limbs, so graceful on horseback, now tangled and awkward. He laughed at himself, a full, genuine sound that echoed in the quiet garden. In that shared laughter, their carefully constructed walls crumbled. They sat on a stone bench overlooking a still pond, the surface a perfect mirror of the deepening sky. The vulnerabilities began to surface, spoken in hushed tones as if they were secrets being confided to the night itself. "When you're up there," he asked, his voice soft, "flying through the air, what does it feel like?" Avery thought for a moment, seeking words for a feeling that had always been beyond them. "It feels silent," she confessed. "For a second, the whole world disappears. The crowd, the bar, the fear, it all just vanishes. There's no past, no future, just up. But then gravity wins. It always wins." She looked at her hands, the calluses a map of her life's work. "And the landing can be brutal." He nodded, understanding more than she'd said. "I know what you mean." He stared out at the dark water. Everyone sees the medals, the polished boots, the perfect lines. They don't see the years of wondering if you're a fraud. My father, my grandfather, they were legends in this sport. I've spent my whole life trying to fill their shadow. He let out a slow breath. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm more afraid of losing or of finally winning and discovering it wasn't enough. That I wasn't enough without the horse, without the competition." His fear was a mirror of her own. What was she without the vault? Who was Avery Monroe if she wasn't flying? They were two sides of the same golden coin, each terrified of the silence that would come after the cheering stopped. He turned to face her. The space between them suddenly charged, intimate. The cool evening air felt electric against her heated skin. His green eyes searched hers, finding the same raw honesty she saw in his. He leaned in, slowly, telegraphing the motion, giving her a universe of time to turn away. She didn't. She couldn't. Her gaze dropped to his lips. A sudden, sharp crack ripped through the night, followed by a brilliant spray of emerald and gold in the sky. A distant firework, then another, and another. A celebration somewhere in the city beyond the garden walls. The moment was broken. Callum pulled back, a faint blush on his cheeks, the almost kiss hanging between them, more potent than if it had landed. The air was thick with unspoken things, with the ghost of a touch and the promise of a feeling neither of them was prepared for. They had escaped the Olympics, but they couldn't escape the intensity. The feeling that this too was a fleeting spectacle against the night sky, beautiful, brilliant, and destined to fade. The digital world moved faster than a sprinter, and with far more cruelty. The next morning it happened, a grainy long-lens photo plastered across sports blogs and gossip sites. Olympic romance! American vaulter Avery Monroe and British equestrian star Callum Hawthorne share a secret rendezvous at Versailles. The image was innocuous, just the two of them laughing on the stone bench, but the speculation was venomous. Avery's coach was furious. "A distraction. You're days away from the most important night of your life, and you're playing tourist with the competition?" Sponsors sent concerned emails. The narrative they had carefully crafted, Avery, the focused, solitary warrior, was being compromised. The pressure, already immense, became suffocating. Callum faced a similar storm. His father called from England, his voice tight with disappointment. "Your focus should be on the team, son, not on some dalliance that the tabloids can twist." The magic of Versailles evaporated under the harsh glare of public scrutiny. When they finally managed to meet, finding a secluded spot along the banks of the Seine, the air between them was tense and brittle. The easy trust they had built felt like a distant memory. "This is a nightmare," Avery said, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "They're calling it a romantic fling. They're making it cheap." "Does it matter what they call it?" Callum countered, though his own frustration was evident in the hard line of his jaw. "We know what it was." "Do we?" Avery's voice was sharp, laced with the panic that had been building all day. "What was it, Callum? Nice break from training, a little adventure. Maybe they're right. Maybe this is just Olympic fever. 2 weeks of make-believe before we go back to our real lives." The words hurt him. She could see it in the way his shoulders slumped. "Make-believe?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Is that what last night felt like to you? Because it felt more real to me than anything that's happened in this ridiculous, gilded bubble." "Real has consequences," she shot back, gesturing wildly at the city around them. "I have sacrificed everything for this. My friends, my family, a normal life. I have bled for this, cried for it. I can't let it all be jeopardized by a photo." The sky, which had been a bruised purple, opened up without warning. A sudden, violent summer downpour sent Parisians scattering for cover. The rain came down in hard, slanting sheets, plastering their hair to their faces in seconds, drenching their clothes. It felt biblical, a physical manifestation of the storm raging between them. Callum grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the shelter of an ancient stone bridge. They huddled underneath, the roar of the rain on the archway drowning out the city, creating a private, echoing chamber. Water dripped from the stone and the river churned beside them. They stood in silence for a long moment, the steam of their breath mingling in the cool, damp air. The anger had washed away with the rain, leaving behind only the raw, painful truth. "I'm scared," Avery finally whispered, the confession torn from her. Her voice broke. "I've spent my entire life learning how to be strong. I don't know how to be this, vulnerable, worried about what someone else thinks, what someone else feels." She looked up at him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I've spent my whole life vaulting over barriers. Physical ones. I know how to do that. Don't ask me to build new ones, Callum, not between us. I don't think I'm strong enough to get over them." His expression softened, the fight draining from his face, replaced by an overwhelming wave of tenderness. He reached out and gently brushed a wet strand of hair from her cheek. The thunder rolled, a deep percussive beat that seemed to mirror the pounding in her chest. "Avery," he said, his voice a low vibration in the echoing space. "Look at me." She did, and in his eyes she saw no judgment, only her own reflection, stripped bare of all her defences. "I'm not a barrier," he murmured, stepping closer, his hand cradling her jaw. "I'm not a distraction. I'm just here, and I'm just as scared as you are." And then he closed the small distance between them. His kiss wasn't like the one they'd almost shared in the garden, gentle and tentative. This was a kiss of absolute certainty, a desperate collision of two souls who had found each other in the heart of a storm. It was raw and honest, tasting of rainwater and salt, and a longing so profound it ached. It was a surrender and a claiming, a silent promise made under the drumming heart of the rain. In the shadow of the bridge, with the world washed away, they were no longer athletes with the weight of nations on their shoulders. They were just a man and a woman finding shelter in each other. The air inside the Stade de France was a living thing, a roaring 70,000-headed beast. Spotlights cut through the humid night air, turning the green field into a stage for legends and heartbreaks. It was the night of the women's pole vault finals. It was the night of Avery's entire life. The pressure was a physical weight, heavier than any pole she had ever carried. But a different, sharper anxiety coiled in her stomach. Callum wasn't there. He'd promised to be in the athletes' warm-up area, a quiet point of solidarity before she walked into the lion's den. His absence was a gaping hole in the fabric of the evening. The paparazzi storm had worsened. His team had likely forbidden it. He'd chosen duty. He'd chosen his path, and it had diverged from hers. The thought was a shard of ice in her chest. The kiss under the bridge felt like a dream from another lifetime. She went through the motions, her body on autopilot while her mind was a maelstrom of doubt and hurt. Her first vaults were technically sound, but lacked the effortless flight that defined her. She cleared the opening heights, but barely, clipping the bar on her way down each time. It trembled, oscillated, but stayed put, a metaphor for her own precarious state. "Monroe looks tight tonight," the commentator's voice would be saying somewhere. Not the confident vaulter we saw in the qualifiers. She felt distracted, heartbroken and utterly alone. With each attempt, the weight of his absence grew heavier. She was proving her coach, the tabloids, her own worst fears right. She had let herself be distracted. She had let her heart wander from the only thing that was supposed to matter. What she didn't know was that at that very moment, Callum was in the fiercest battle of his own Olympic journey, far from any arena. It was a confrontation with his father, who had flown in from London that afternoon. "You will not be seen with that girl tonight," his father had commanded in the sterile quiet of his hotel room. "You are a Hawthorn. The team won its medal. Your job now is to be an ambassador, to represent our name with dignity, not to be a feature in some sordid gossip column." For the first time, Callum saw the truth. His father's pride wasn't in him, but in a legacy, a name. He was just its current caretaker. And in that moment, he realised that the fear of not being enough had been his father's voice in his head all along. Avery hadn't been a distraction from his duty. She had been a signpost pointing toward his own life. "My duty," Callum said, his voice unnervingly calm, "is to a person who showed me that my worth isn't tied to a medal or a family name. Some distances can't be measured in medals, Father. I'm done letting you be the judge of mine." He had walked out, leaving his father speechless, and raced to the stadium, fighting his way through the crowds. Back on the field, Avery was facing her final attempt at a height that would put her in contention for gold. She had 2 misses, one more and her Olympics were over. She stood at the end of the runway, the roar of the crowd fading to a dull hum. She felt hollowed out. She closed her eyes, chalk dust clinging to her sweating palms. "I thought winning was about being perfect," she thought, a tear tracing a path through the chalk on her cheek. "But maybe it's about being brave enough to fall." She opened her eyes for one last look at the monstrous height of the bar. And then she saw him. He wasn't in the VIP box or the athletes section. He was in the stands, halfway up, just a face in the crowd, drenched in sweat from his sprint to get here. But his eyes found hers across the stadium, and in them she saw everything. The apology, the struggle, the choice. He had chosen to be there. For her. A profound calm washed over Avery. The roaring beast of the crowd went silent. The weight of the world, the need for gold, the fear of failure, it all dissolved. Her heart, which had felt like a stone in her chest, suddenly felt light, buoyant. She wasn't vaulting against the others anymore. She wasn't vaulting for a medal, for her country, or for the coaches. She took a deep breath and began her run. It was the most beautiful sprint of her life. Her feet barely seemed to touch the track. The plant was perfect, the pole bent, storing all her hope and heartache and newfound freedom in its curve. And then it released her. She soared. In that moment of weightless silence at the apex, she wasn't alone. It was not an escape from the world, but a connection to it, to him. She twisted, arched, and cleared the bar with inches to spare. The landing in the soft pit was a gentle arrival, not a crash. The stadium erupted. Camera flashes went off like 1,000 new stars being born. She looked at the bar, still resting peacefully, then looked back at Callum. He was just a man in a crowd, but for her, he was the only person in the world. She didn't win gold that night. A rival surpassed her on the final attempt. But as the silver medal was placed around her neck, its cool weight felt different than she'd ever imagined. It wasn't a symbol of coming in second. It was a testament to having been brave enough to risk everything, and in doing so finding something she never knew she was searching for. The closing ceremony was a kaleidoscope of joy and relief. Fireworks cracked open against the Parisian night, showering the city in ephemeral blossoms of light. Below, the Eiffel Tower glowed, a proud golden sentinel, watching over the end of an era. Amid the celebrating crowds, the athletes with medals around their necks and relief on their faces, Avery and Callum found each other at a quiet overlook. The city spread before them like a blanket of jewels. Avery's silver medal felt solid and real against her chest, a stark contrast to the weightless feeling she'd had during the vault. Callum wasn't wearing his team medal. Tonight was not about their accolades. "I'm sorry I was late," he said, his voice soft, cutting through the celebratory noise. "You were right on time," she replied, her smile genuine. She knew, without him having to say a word, what it had cost him to be there. It was a gesture more valuable than any precious metal. They stood in a comfortable silence for a while, watching the fireworks paint the sky. The Olympic flame, which had burned so brightly, would soon be extinguished. The thought sent a small, anxious flutter through Avery's heart. The bubble was about to burst. "What if we're terrible at this?" she asked, voicing the fear that lingered beneath the surface of her joy. "When the world stops watching, when there are no grandstands or stolen moments in gardens, when it's just Tuesday in 2 different countries." Callum turned to her, his green eyes serious in the golden glow of the tower. "Then we'll be terrible at it together at first, and then we'll learn. No crowds, no cameras, just us. We learn to ride a horse, we learn to fly over a bar, we can learn to cross an ocean." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small old-fashioned brass compass. It was worn, the edges smooth from time. "This was my grandfather's," he said. "He told me it would always point me true north. For a long time I thought that meant my career, my legacy." He pressed it into her palm, his fingers closing hers around it. "I was wrong. True north isn't a place. It's a feeling. It's you." Avery's breath caught. The weight of the compass in her hand was the weight of a promise of a future. She fumbled with the simple elastic tie that had held her hair back during the final. It was a worn, simple thing, her lucky charm for a decade. She had vaulted with it thousands of times. It had been with her at her lowest and now her highest. She took his hand and wrapped the simple band around his wrist. "It's not a family heirloom," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It's just a piece of elastic, but it's been with me every time I was brave enough to fly." He looked down at the band on his wrist, then back at her. The gesture was a perfect echo of his own, an exchange of personal totems, of private histories, a commitment to try, to build a bridge across the distance that would soon separate them. As the grand finale of fireworks exploded overhead, bathing them in cascading light, Callum drew her into an embrace. It wasn't the desperate rain-soaked kiss under the bridge, nor the chaste, interrupted moment in the garden. This was something new. It was a kiss filled with a quiet, certain hope. It tasted of champagne bubbles and bitter-sweet endings of a story that was just beginning. They say Olympic dreams last only 16 days, but some connections transcend the closing ceremony. As Paris and its magical fleeting lights prepared to fade behind them, Avery and Callum carried something more precious than gold, more lasting than a record. They carried the knowledge that the greatest victories aren't measured in seconds or meters, but in the rare and breathtaking courage to love long after the world has stopped watching. Shake, Rattle, and Love. The heat in Memphis in July of 1956 was a physical presence, a thick, damp blanket that smelled of honeysuckle and hot asphalt. It seeped through the thick stone walls of the Magnolia Baptist Church, settling in the basement where 19-year-old Magnolia June Whitfield was committing a sin. Or, if not a sin, then something dangerously close to it. Sunlight, fractured by the stained glass windows of the sanctuary upstairs, fell in jewelled patterns across the scattered hymnal sheets and the scarred wood of the old upright piano. Her Sunday dress, a pale yellow cotton that her father had called the very picture of piety, rustled as she hunched over the keys. The same hands that played Amazing Grace with reverent grace on Sunday morning now carved out rhythms that felt like they could make the angels weep, or maybe, just maybe, make them want to dance. This was her secret. By day, she was the preacher's daughter, a model of quiet conformity. But in these stolen hours, with a pencil tucked behind her ear and her heart pounding a syncopated beat against her ribs, she was M.J. White. M.J. White, the mysterious lyricist whose words were currently crackling from radios all across the South, sung by a boy with a voice like lightning and a sneer that broke girls' hearts. 3 songs had made their way from this dusty basement to the airwaves, carried on scraps of paper she mailed to Sun Records with a trembling hand and a prayer for anonymity. Her fingers found a new chord, a bluesy, mournful sound that slid into something faster, something with a pulse. "Midnight train on a one-way track," she hummed, her voice a hushed whisper, so different from the clear soprano she used in the choir. The melody came first, always. It would rise into her, a wild, untamable thing, and she'd wrestle it onto the page, pinning it down with words that spoke of things she wasn't supposed to know. Lonely highways, stolen kisses, the desperate ache of wanting something you couldn't have. Her internal monologue was a constant frantic prayer. Every note I write feels like a prayer backwards, reaching for something wholly in the wrong direction. But she couldn't stop. This music was the only place she felt truly herself, the only place the suffocating weight of being Reverend Samuel Whitfield's perfect daughter was lifted. It was a language her soul spoke fluently, even if her mouth was forbidden to utter it. She scribbled furiously on a fresh sheet of manuscript paper, the graphite pencil scratching a rhythm of its own. Heartbreak engine, running hot and fast. Got a ticket to nowhere, hoping it'll last. The lyrics felt dangerous, illicit. They were the stories of the people her father preached about saving, the lost souls wandering in the wilderness. But to Magnolia, they didn't feel lost. They felt alive. A floorboard creaked overhead. She froze, her hand hovering over the page. "Magnolia, child?" Her father's voice. It was a voice made for pulpits and benedictions, deep and resonant. A sound that could both comfort a grieving widow and condemn a sinner in the same breath. It drifted down the wooden staircase in a familiar chill, part fear and part guilt, traced its way down her spine. "You're needed in the sanctuary," he called. Her heart hammered. With movements made swift by long practice, she gathered the loose sheets of her devil's music. She lifted a heavy stack of hymnals, the old rugged cross, What a Friend We Have in Jesus, and slid her rockabilly confessions beneath them, bearing the raw, rebellious heartbeat of M.J. White under the steadfast piety of Magnolia June Whitfield. She smoothed her dress, took a deep, calming breath that did nothing to calm her, and forced a placid smile onto her face. As she climbed the stairs, the distant muffled sounds of Beale Street drifted through an open window. A saxophone's lonely wail, a burst of laughter, the low thrum of a world she was only allowed to glimpse. It was the world her music lived in, a world of neon signs and dance halls, a world that existed in stark, vibrant contrast to the hallowed silence of the sanctuary she was about to enter. She could still feel the phantom rhythm in her fingertips, a ghost of the song she'd been writing. It was a secret pulse, a second heartbeat, thrumming just beneath the surface of the quiet, obedient girl she pretended to be. And she knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and thrilling, that one day the secret would have to come out. The sound was getting too loud to hide. The light at Sun Records was the colour of whiskey. It poured through the grimy windows in the late afternoon, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air and curling through the grey plumes of cigarette smoke. This place was its own kind of church, a cathedral of sound where Sam Phillips was the high priest and the new gospel was a raucous, hip-shaking beat called rock and roll, and Jackson Jax Tanner was its newest disciple. At 22, Jax moved with a restless energy, as if he were constantly hearing a rhythm no one else could. He had calloused hands from wrestling with his guitar, and eyes the colour of a summer storm just before it breaks. He was leaning against a recording console, listening to the playback of his latest track. The song was a scorcher, destined for the top of the charts, but it was the lyrics that haunted him. They were penned by the enigmatic MJ White, and they fit his voice, his soul, like they'd been tailored for him. Got a heart full of gravel and a soul full of gin. Don't know where I'm going, but I know where I've been. Who was this MJ White? The letters always arrived in plain envelopes, postmarked Memphis, the lyrics written on crisp manuscript paper, but the last one had been different. Tucked into the envelope, almost as an afterthought, was a small folded programme. On the front, an embossed cross and the words, Magnolia Baptist Church, Sunday Service. On the back, in the corner, a faint pencil smudge of a musical notation. A mistake. A clue. "Sam," Jack said, his voice a low drawl that cut through the music. "I'm going to find this ghost." An hour later, Jax's motorcycle rumbled to a stop across the street from the church. Evening service was letting out. Families in their Sunday best spilled onto the manicured lawn, their voices a polite murmur against the backdrop of singing cicadas. It was a world away from the raw energy of Sun Records. Then he saw her. She was standing on the steps, bathed in the amber glow of a streetlight that filtered through the heavy branches of a magnolia tree draped in Spanish moss. She was talking to an older man, the preacher by the look of his stern face and black suit. Jax's eyes weren't on her prim dress or the careful way she held her hands clasped in front of her. They were on her fingers. As she gestured, her long, slender fingers seemed to trace invisible melodies in the humid night air. The same fingers, he'd bet his soul, that wrote the notes smudged on the back of that church programme. He waited, the engine of his bike a low, rhythmic pulse like a waiting heartbeat. When the preacher went inside and she began to walk towards the quiet side street where a modest Ford was parked, he pushed off the kickstand and glided across the asphalt, cutting her off. Magnolia gasped, her hand flying to her chest. A man on a motorcycle, all black leather and denim, was blocking her path. He swung a leg over the bike, and in the dim light she recognised him instantly from the cover of a record sleeve in a shop window she'd hurried past just last week. Jackson Tanner. "Evening, ma'am," he said, his voice smoother than she expected, but with an edge to it. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice tight with nerves. This was a collision of worlds she had spent her life keeping separate. He took a step closer into the pool of light. His stormy eyes scanned her face, then dropped to her hands, which she quickly hid in the folds of her skirt. "I think you can," he said softly. He reached into his leather jacket and pulled out a folded piece of sheet music. It was hers, the one with the lyrics for Midnight Highway. Those hands, they wrote this, didn't they? The world tilted. The sound of the cicadas grew deafeningly loud. Her secret, her precious, terrible secret, was staring her in the face with eyes that saw far too much. I don't know what you're talking about." A slow smile spread across his face, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Don't lie to me, Angel. I saw you from across the street. I know rebellion when I see it, even when it's dressed up for church." He took another step, closing the space between them. He smelled of gasoline and something else, something wild and free. I've been singing your words for 6 months. It feels like I know you, MJ White. He said the name, her name, and the sound of it in the open air felt like a judgment. Tears pricked her eyes, not of sadness, but of pure, unadulterated terror, and somewhere beneath it, a misère spark of relief. The weight was cracking. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This music, it's everything I am, and it's everything I can't be." He watched her, his expression softening from accusation to a kind of raw understanding. "Maybe," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "you just need someone to help you be it." He looked from her frightened eyes to the stone church behind her, then back again. "The devil's at your door, Magnolia June. You gonna invite him in?" The invitation came at dawn. Jax had told her to meet him where the city ended and the river began, and as Magnolia crept out of the parsonage, the sky was a soft, bruised purple. Mist rose from the Mississippi like ghosts, shrouding the awakening Memphis skyline in a dreamlike haze. She saw him standing by the riverbank, a dark silhouette against the burgeoning light, skipping a flat stone across the water's placid surface. The air was cool and clean, filled with the sound of morning birds and the distant low hum of the city coming to life. It felt like the world spinning toward possibilities she'd only ever dreamed of in the darkness of the church basement. "I was beginning to think you wouldn't come," Jax said, not turning as she approached. The stone skipped 4 times before sinking without a trace. "I almost didn't," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. She clutched her cardigan tighter around herself, a useless shield against more than the morning chill. He finally turned to face her. In the soft morning light, the hard edges of his rock and roll persona seemed to have softened. He just looked like a young man with a heavy heart and a hopeful gaze. "I meant what I said last night," he began, his voice earnest. "Your words, they have a soul. People feel it. I feel it. Music like that doesn't belong in the shadows, Magnolia. It deserves a stage. It deserves a voice. Your voice." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle between them. "I'm starting a tour. 5 cities across the South. I want you to come with me, not as MJ White, the ghost in the machine, as you. We can tell people you co-wrote the songs, you can play piano, maybe even sing with me." The proposition hung in the air, shimmering with terrifying potential. It was everything she'd ever secretly wanted. The open road, the music, played loud and proud. A life where she didn't have to hide the most essential part of herself. But then the image of her father's face rose in her mind, his disappointment, a force more powerful than any sermon. "I can't," she said, the words tasting like ash. "My father, the church, they would never understand. It would break his heart." As she spoke, a memory sharp and painful pierced through the morning mist. She was 10 years old, standing at her mother's bedside. The room smelled of sickness and fading roses. Her mother, her face pale and thin, had taken Magnolia's small hand. "Be good, my June bug," she'd whispered, her voice a fragile thread. "Promise me you'll be good for your father. He'll need you to be his light." Magnolia had promised, and for 9 years she had tried to be nothing but that light, a perfect, steady flame of piety and obedience. This music, this man, this offer, it wasn't light, it were fire. Jax seemed to see the storm of conflict in her eyes. "My old man was a preacher too," he said quietly, surprising her. "He kicked me out when I was 17 for choosing a guitar over a Bible, said I was trading my salvation for a cheap thrill." He looked out at the river, his jaw tight. "For a long time I believed him. I thought you had to choose, but what you do, what we could do together, it ain't cheap. It's the most honest thing I've ever known." He stepped closer, his voice dropping with intensity. "Come with me, Magnolia, just for the tour. Let Memphis hear what heaven really sounds like when it's got a little bit of hell in it." She looked from his face so full of passionate conviction to the wide, muddy river flowing beside them. The river was a boundary separating the life she knew from a life she could barely imagine. To cross it felt like a betrayal of every promise she had ever made. Her mother's dying wish, her father's unwavering faith, the safety of her entire world. A tugboat sounded its lonely horn in the distance, a mournful, resonant call. It sounded like a choice. She closed her eyes, and a different voice whispered from a place deep inside her, a voice that had been silenced for years. "Mother, forgive me," it said, "but I'm tired of being the daughter you needed instead of the woman I am." She opened her eyes and looked at Jax, the rising sun catching fire in his hair. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but for the first time it was eclipsed by a flicker of hope. "Okay," she heard herself say, the single word a stone skipping across the water, headed for the other side. "I'll go." 3 weeks felt like a lifetime. The girl who had crept out of the Memphis parsonage was gone, and in her place was Maggie June. The name was Jax's idea, a little bit of her past, a little bit of her future. And tonight, Maggie Jewel June was electric. The stage at the Cotton Club in Nashville was hot and bright, the lights blinding. Below, a sea of faces, teenagers mostly, screamed and danced, their bodies moving to a rhythm she had created in the sacred quiet of a church basement. She sat at a gleaming black piano, her fingers flying across the keys, no longer hiding. Beside her, Jax ripped a solo from his guitar, sweat beading on his brow, a grin of pure, unadulterated joy on his face. They launched into Midnight Highway, their biggest hit. When the chorus came, Jax stepped back from his microphone and nodded to her. It was her cue. For the first time on the tour, she was going to sing with him. She took a breath and her voice, clear and strong, blended with his. "Heartbreak engine running hot and fast. Got a ticket to nowhere, hoping it'll last." A roar went up from the crowd, a wave of energy so powerful it felt like it could lift the roof off the building. She caught Jax's eye, and in that moment, under the heat of the lights, with their voices tangled together in a song of her own making, she had never felt more alive, more completely herself. This wasn't sin. This was glorious. Backstage was a chaotic whirlwind of roadies, smoke and adrenaline. As the applause finally faded, Jax grabbed her hand, his eyes shining with a fierce pride. "Don't you see?" he said, his voice hoarse over the din. "This is who you're meant to be, wild and free and real." He pulled her into a small, cluttered dressing room away from the noise. The energy from the stage still crackled between them, an invisible current that had been building for weeks. It was in the shared glances, the hands that brushed in passing, the harmony of their voices. Now, in the sudden intimacy of the small room, it was overwhelming. He gently touched her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "Magnolia," he whispered, using her real name like a prayer. And then he leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't a tentative, stolen kiss. It was a kiss of homecoming, of recognition. It tasted of sweat and success and the promise of 1,000 more songs. All the longing she had ever poured onto paper, all the secret desires she'd hidden beneath hymnals, erupted in a firestorm of feeling. She kissed him back with all the pent-up passion of a girl who had just discovered she was free. Their embrace was broken by a frantic knock on the door. A harried-looking stage manager stuck his head in. "Maggie, Jax, there's a telegram for you, miss." He handed her the small yellow envelope. Her heart, which had been soaring moments before, plummeted. Telegrams only ever meant one thing. Her hand trembled as she tore it open. The stark black letters seemed to leap off the page. "Reverend Whitfield suffered acute heart attack. Critical. Come home. Church prays for your soul. Deacon Morrison." The roar of the crowd still echoing in her ears, was replaced by a terrible, deafening silence. The world spun out of focus. "Church prays for your soul." The words were a condemnation, a verdict. They weren't just praying for her father's health, they were blaming her for its failure. Her fall from grace had, in their eyes, literally broken her father's heart. The taste of triumph turned to ash in her mouth. The joy she'd felt on stage, the passion of Jax's kiss, now felt like a terrible, selfish betrayal. She looked from the telegram to Jax's worried face, and the beautiful, vibrant world they had started to build together crumbled into dust. She had chosen the fire, and in doing so she had burned down everything she'd left behind. The cost of her song was a price she wasn't sure she could bear to pay. 6 months later, the pews of Magnolia Baptist Church were filled for Sunday service. The Memphis heat was just as oppressive, but inside Magnolia's heart a fragile winter had given way to a tentative spring. She had come home, she had sat by her father's bedside, read him scripture, and held his hand through the long, quiet nights of his recovery. She had been the dutiful daughter once more, and in the crucible of that shared vulnerability, something had shifted between them. Her father, Reverend Samuel Whitfield, sat in the front pew, paler and thinner, but with a new softness in his eyes. His brush with mortality had scraped away some of the rigid certainty, leaving behind a man who was beginning to understand that God's world was wider and more mysterious than he had ever preached. Magnolia sat at the old upright piano, the same one where her secrets had been born. She was supposed to be playing the prelude, a traditional rendition of "It Is Well With My Soul." Her fingers moved over the keys, the familiar chords filling the sanctuary, but the music inside her, the insistent, rebellious rhythm she had tried so hard to silence, would not die. It was a part of her soul, as sacred as any hymn. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she began to change the rhythm. A subtle syncopation crept into the left hand, a bluesy note slid into the melody. It was still the beloved hymn, but it now had a heartbeat, a gentle sway, a touch of the Beale Street soul she carried within her. A few heads in the congregation lifted. Deacon Morrison shot her a sharp, questioning look, but her father simply closed his eyes, a faint, knowing smile gracing his lips. As the last, transformed chord faded into the hallowed silence, the back door of the church creaked open. Jack stood there, framed in the morning light. He wasn't the swaggering rock star from the stage. He looked humbled, his usual restless energy replaced by a quiet reverence. He had performed their songs for months without her, and he'd discovered they were just words and notes. She had been the soul. His eyes found hers across the sanctuary, and in that single look, 6 months of pain, guilt, and longing were communicated and understood. After the service, her father approached them in the shade of the old magnolia tree. He looked at Jax, not with condemnation, but with a thoughtful curiosity. "Mr. Tanner," he said, his voice weaker but still resonant, "I have spent my life preaching about the word, but I am learning that the Lord speaks in many voices, even," he added with a glance at his daughter, "through guitars and drums." He placed a hand on Magnolia's shoulder. "I listened to one of your records, the one about the highway." He paused. "It sounded like a psalm for the lonely. Go, child, sing your psalms. Just promise me you'll remember the way home." It wasn't just permission, it was a blessing. Tears streamed down Magnolia's face as she hugged her father, a lifetime of fear and guilt washing away in a tide of grace. Later, standing with Jax by the riverbank where he'd first made his offer, they planned a new future, a new tour, one that didn't run from her roots but embraced them. They would write songs that bridged the gap between Saturday night and Sunday morning, between the sinner and the saint. Their wedding was held a year later in the same church where it all began. The stained glass windows cast their jewelled light on a strange and beautiful scene. Magnolia wore a simple white dress, her hair unbound. Jack stood beside her, his hand steady in hers. In the corner, his rockabilly band stood ready, not with amplifiers, but with acoustic guitars and a stand-up bass. When the ceremony was over, they didn't play the traditional wedding march. Instead, the first notes of Amazing Grace filled the sanctuary, played with a slow, soulful rockabilly swing. And as Magnolia and Jax walked down the aisle, the congregation, once so rigid in their piety, rose to their feet. They began to clap, then to sway, and soon the people of Magnolia Baptist Church were dancing, their joy a new and unconventional prayer. Love, they were all discovering, had a way of making all things sacred. It was the bridge between what was and what could be, the song that turned rebels into believers, and believers into something beautifully, wonderfully human. It was the rhythm that two hearts find together, the moment the real music begins.